Greetings everyone. Today we are going to report about the chapter 10 entitled Standard Costs and Variances. The learning objectives. After studying chapter 10, you should be able to compute the direct materials price and quantity variances and explain their significance, compute the direct labor rate and efficiency variances and explain their significance. Third, compute the variable manufacturing overhead rate and efficiency variances and explain their significance. Fourth, on the Appendix 10A, which you're going to compute and interpret the fixed overhead budget and volume variances. And lastly, on the Appendix 10B, which you're going to prepare journal entries to record standard costs and variances. Standard costs setting the stage. A standard is a benchmark of measuring performance. Standards are found everywhere. Auto service centers like the Firestone and Sears, for example, often set specific labor time standards for their completion of certain tasks such as installing a carburetor or doing a valve job and then measure actual performance against these standards. The fast food outlets such as McDonald's and Subway have exacting standards for the quantity of meat going into a sandwich as well as the standards for the cost of the meat. Your doctor also evaluates your weight using standards for individuals of your age, height, and even the gender. The buildings we live in conform to standards set in building codes. So, standards are also widely used in managerial accounting, where they relate to the quantity and acquisition of price of inputs used in manufacturing goods or providing services. The quantity standards specify how much of an input should be used to make a product or service, or to provide a service rather. The price standards specify how much should be paid for each unit of the input. If either the quantity or acquisition price of an input departs significantly from the standard, then the managers would investigate the discrepancy to find the cause of the problem and eliminate it. So, next, we will demonstrate how a company can establish quantity and price standards for direct materials, direct labor, and the variable manufacturing overhead. And then, we will discuss how those standards can be used to calculate variances and manage operations. Managerial accounting in action. The Colonial Pewter Company makes only one product, an elaborate reproduction of an 18th century pewter statue. So the statue is made largely by hand using traditional metal working tools. So consequently, the manufacturing process labor is intensive and it requires a high level of skill. So the Colonial Pewter has recently expanded its workforce to take advantage of the unexpected demand for the statue as a gift. The company started with a small cadre of experienced pewter workers, but has had to hire less experienced workers as a result of the expansion. So, the president of the company, Reston, has called a meeting to discuss production problems. And the attendees of the meetings are Tom, the production manager, Janet Warner, the purchasing manager, and Terry Sherman, the corporate controller. So, setting direct material standards. So, Terry Sherman, first task was to prepare quantity and price standards for the company's only significant raw material, the pewter ingots. So, the standard quantity per unit defines the amount of direct materials that should be used for each unit of the finished product, including the allowance for the normal inefficiencies, such as the scrap and even the spoilage. So, after consulting within the production manager, Tom, Terry set the quantity standard for pewter at 3.0 pounds per statue. So the standard price per unit defines the price that should be paid for each unit of direct materials, and it should reflect the final delivered cost of those materials. So after consulting with the purchasing manager, which is Warner, Terry set the standard price of pewter at $4 per pound. So once Terry established the quantity and price standards, he computed the standards direct materials cost per statue as follows. So 3.0 pounds per statue multiplied by the $4 per pound, which is equal to the $12 per statue. So let's go to the setting direct labor standards. So direct labor quantity and price standards are usually expressed in terms of labor hours or a labor rate. So the standard hours per unit defines the amount of the direct labor hours that should be used to produce 1 unit of finished goods. One approach used to determine this standard is for an industrial engineer to do a time and motion study. So actually clocking the time required for each tasks. So throughout the chapter, we will assume that tight but attainable labor standards are used rather than ideal standards that can only be attained by the most skilled and efficient employees working at peak effort 100% of the time. So therefore, after consulting with the production manager and considering reasonable allowances for breaks, personal needs of employees, the cleanup, the machine downtime, Terry set the standard hours per unit at 0.50 direct labor hours per statue. The standard rate per hour defines the company's expected direct labor wage rate per hour, including employment taxes and even the fringe benefits. So, using wage records and in consultation with the production manager, Terry Sherman established a standard rate per hour of $22. So the standard rate reflects the expected mix of workers, even though the actual hourly wage rates may vary somewhat from individual to individual due to differing skills or seniority. So once Terry established the time and rate standards, he computed the standard's direct labor cost per statue as follows. 0.50 direct labor hours per statue multiplied by the $22 per direct labor hour is equals to $11 per statue. So let's go to setting variable manufacturing overhead standards. So as with direct labor, the quantity and price standards for the variable manufacturing overhead are usually expressed in terms of hours and rate. The standard hours per unit for variable overhead measures the amount of the allocation based from a company's predetermined overhead rate that is required to produce 1 unit of the finished goods. In the case of the Colonial Pewter, we will assume that the company uses direct labor hours as a location based in the predetermined overhead rate. So therefore, the standard hours per unit for the variable overhead is exactly the same as the standards hour per unit for direct labor, which is 0.50 direct labor hours per statue. The standard rate per unit that a company expects to pay for a variable overhead equals the variable portion of the predetermined overhead rate. At the Colonial Pewter, the variable portion of the predetermined overhead rate is $6 per direct labor hour. Therefore, Terry computed the standard variable manufacturing overhead rate cost per statue as follows. 0.50 direct labor hours per statue multiplied by the $6 per direct labor hour is equals to $3 per statue. So this is the standard cost card for the variable manufacturing costs. So this $3 per unit cost for the variable manufacturing overhead appears along with the direct materials, which cost $12 per unit, and the direct labor, which costs $11 per unit on the standard cost card in Exhibit 10-1 shown in the slide. So a standard cost card shows the standard quantity or hours and standard price or rate of the inputs required to produce a unit of a specific product. So the standard cost per unit for all the three variable manufacturing cost is computed the same way. So the standard quantity or hours per unit is multiplied by the standard price or rate per unit to obtain the standard cost per unit.